I am the Reverend Jackie Utley, and I pastor the Ascension Lutheran Church in the Eau Claire community of North Columbia, South Carolina. I've been a pastor there at Ascension for the past 10 years. As far as my background, I was born in the 50s, in the 1950s, born in 1956 in a little one-horse town called Lakeview, South Carolina, in Dillon County. I'm the youngest of seven children. 1, 2, 3, 4 siblings, and my mother and my father. It's a kind of torn picture. A father who was a staunch African Methodist Episcopal, and a mother that was a zealous Pentecostal holiness. And every one of my siblings are ministers. They went into the ministry, but they all went in apostolic holiness. My mother forbid me to go to college after high school, and I couldn't go. What profiteth a man to gain? I never attended college out of high school. And so I was, let's say, maybe right at 45 years old when and it was a call from God to further my education. I took an early retirement from the telephone company there in Connecticut. I entered school and I graduated in 2004 with a Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology. Graduated summa cum laude, mind you, at that age, and it was like nothing but the Holy Spirit. I had no desire to further my education or to get a degree. He was the one who said God told him to tell Sister Jackie to go to the Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary to get her Master of Divinity degree. Them Lutherans ain't saved like us, he said. The Lutherans are some of the best folks you ever they some good white folks. That was plain and simple what he said about coming here to the Lutheran Church. He says God spoke and said, tell Sister Jackie to go to that seminary. And I go, Lutheran seminary? I had read about Luther, and I was fascinated by Luther, and I was fascinated about maybe attending a Lutheran church years prior to this, and someone said, oh, that's an all-white church down here in the South. You wouldn't even be welcome to it, so don't even consider it. And so I pushed that on the back burner. But here this man is telling me, God is telling me to have you go to this Lutheran seminary.
I saw the light, no more darkness, no more night.
Go sit in a white church with quiet people that don't even say hallelujah, thank you Jesus, don't raise their hands above their waist, and be happy on a Sunday morning? No way, God can't be calling me.
No more darling.
And I'm Pentecostal trained, black church trained in my way of thinking and worshiping. So this seminary, of which I was living on full time on the campus in the dorm, and as a Pentecostal, as a black, the only black and the only Pentecostal living full time in the dormitory on the campus, and I'm learning some things from the theology, the liturgy, the litanies, and everything that I'm experiencing was really starting to sink in.
There was all the light. Praise the Lord.
I coined a phrase that I say, I call myself having gotten Lutheranized. It's like I heard God speak at that very moment and said, are you ready now to go and serve in the Lutheran Church? And I was like, I'm in. When? With me making history and all as the pastor here, first female and first African American of this church. Here, and I tell you, I just read this. Here's my letter of call they put in there, the report of ordination, a letter from Dr. Fred Reese, who was the president of the seminary at the time that I was attending there, a letter from the governor, Nikki Haley, at that time, that was congratulating me. I was ordained by 4 bishops. Turns out that it was at the Synod Assembly down in Charleston, and the bishop from Tanzania was here, from Colombia, and Japan. Well, all 4 of these bishops, with Yost, the bishop of the South Carolina Synod, all 4 of these bishops laid hands on me for my ordination, and we say that's what it took to turn a Pentecostal into a Lutheran pastor. So I now call myself a Luthercostal.
You didn't know that was in them slides, but
This documentary that you're a part of, that we're doing right now,
Yes.
entitled UNSUNG, a Chronicle of Black Lutherans in the South.
Yes.
Given the fact that you had no prior experience until you were middle-aged,
Yeah,
or even knew there was such a thing as a Black Lutheran,
that's right.
now that you have become a part of the Lutheran Church as a person of African descent, why does it matter for people to know about the history of Black Lutherans from your perspective?
Well, just from knowing the historical background of Swedish and German people, Caucasians, Europeans, you know, bringing this faith to America, none of them were black that I'm aware of, or that I knew of. What I discovered was that when I began to go to church-wide assemblies for the ELCA, and I began to meet other Black Lutherans, like I had met Dr. Thomas and Dr. Carroll, they were not Southerners, as far as I'm concerned. New York and Chicago, that was common that you would run into Black Lutherans in those cities, those states, or what have you. Atlanta, Georgia, I think they were. I attended a church with a Black Lutheran pastor. There were Black Lutherans in it. Well, that was all fascinating to me. And I kind of knew then that, wow, I believe God is calling our people to this particular church.
One of the things about the story is it's been there from the very beginning. I don't think we sometimes realize that. But the story of Black Lutherans in the South is one that's been present from the very beginning of our experience as Lutherans in the South. In fact, the oldest Lutheran congregation in the South, in Region 9, is predominantly Black descent Lutheran congregation. And that's Frederick Lutheran Church in the Virgin Islands, founded in 1666. On the mainland, the story begins at the very beginning of settlement here in South Carolina, for example. Enslaved persons were brought to these shores as very early on, as early as Europeans. And so they were present from the very beginning of the story.
Many former slaves were attracted to the church, specifically to Lutheranism, one, because of its theology, but also because of the freeing nature of Christian baptism. There's something freeing about it. You might even say that was political about it, because these former slaves no longer saw themselves as slaves, but free sons and daughters of God, and that's how they functioned.
In 1814, there was one Lutheran synod in the Southeast, and it was called the Synod of North Carolina and adjacent states. And it included everyone from Virginia all the way down. And in 1814, this synod had to consider what should be our role with our enslaved persons in our congregations. The synod in 1814 took some action. It's called the 5-point plan. And it included things like saying why, yes, persons can be baptized, African Americans can be baptized. African Americans can become members and take communion. African Americans can stand as godparents at the baptism of children. Could be married by Lutheran pastors, could be members of the churches, could take communion, could be baptized. Their marriages were valid unless they were separated from their spouse by sale. And so there was this recognition both of the importance of baptism and communion and marriage, and yet the context in which they found themselves meant that marriage was not going to necessarily last forever.
And so St. Michael was admitted into the North Carolina Synod in October of 1814. And at that meeting, John Dreher requested that the Synod resolve to evangelize the enslaved African Americans or blacks or coloreds in their congregations. Godfrey Dreher's journals, which are very popular and well known, dozens and dozens and dozens of what he referred to as colored children were baptized by Godfrey Dreher in a variety of different congregations, but mostly here at St. Michael. And so we have a congregation here, which is the white church meeting on the floor of the church building, and the colored church, or the African Americans, worshiping from the gallery. And that continues all the way until 1876.
1814, this congregation called the Reverend John Bachman to be its pastor. Dr. Bachman would remain pastor here for almost 60 years until about 1874. He intended to have a ministry with the black community of Charleston, and the vestry readily gave him the approval to do that ministry. This church was planned for a black ministry. There is a black entrance gate on the north side of our church here, which leads directly across the street to where there was a black Sunday school. There are stairwells in the back of the church, especially designed, that lead to the balcony of the church where the black membership of the church worshiped. During the peak of this ministry, which took place somewhere between 1840 and 1850 and 60, during that period of time, the black communicant membership of St. John's Lutheran Church was about 200.
These people who were in the balcony where they couldn't be seen by whites, they had no part in communing white people in the church. So there was an element of white supremacy even in the opening of the doors of St. John's in Charleston and other South Carolina churches that persisted even though a good deed was being done.
One of the interesting things about St. John's Charleston is, in a very common way that churches in Charleston raised funds, they rented their pews. So you paid pew rent to stay in, to have your pew in your congregation. The black members had to pay their pew rent as well as the white members. And so everyone paid pew rent. The most expensive pew rent entitles you to a pew near the front, the least expensive to a pew in the back. St. John's was also distinctive because it had a number of free persons of color as a member of their congregation. That was much more common in a place like Charleston than it would have been in the rural areas. You didn't have that very often in the rural areas. John Bachman was very interested in that. He came from New York State. He was born at a time when slavery was still practiced in New York State, so he grew up around slavery. So that was not unusual to him coming from New York State. When he came down to the South, he discovered the very high population in Charleston of both enslaved and free persons, and just saw that as part of his outreach and his ministry in the Charleston area. He was very intentional about raising up black leadership. So, for example, St. John's almost had a separate congregation within the white congregation. There was a separate black congregation. It had its own leadership. It had its own Sunday school teachers, its own deacons. They raised their own funds to support some of their members. And so that was one of the distinctive things about his ministry there, was he raised up black leadership among that congregation. There are three very significant black leaders who come out of the Charleston area before the Civil War. The first of those is a man named Jehu Jones. Who was a member of St. John's Charleston, had been a protege of John Bachman.
Jones was born and enslaved in Charleston, South Carolina. Jehu Jones had come to the attention of John Bachman at St. John's Lutheran Church in Charleston. His background was Episcopalian. His father was a wealthy black hotel owner in Charleston. A black hotel owner who purchased a hotel for $13,000 in 1835. That's a lot of money for a free black man, but he had it. And he became a student of John Bachman, who taught him catechism, who taught him the Bible, and prepared Jehu Jones for ministry. In 1832, with the encouragement of his pastor, the Reverend John Bachman, who was a principal founder of Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary, Jones traveled to New York for ordination as a missionary to the New York Synod. Bachman probably thought that in South Carolina they were not ready to ordain a black man. 1833, he moved to Philadelphia. A Lutheran Church there appointed Jones as a missionary to the city's black population.
One might recognize him as the first black Lutheran minister who organized a black congregation in this country.
Comes back to get his family because he's going to sail to Liberia. But while he's in New York, the South Carolina legislature passes the Negro Sailors Act, which prohibits African Americans from setting board on a sailing vessel because they're afraid that they're going to spread this gospel of freedom to other people, to other sailors and so forth. And Jehu Jones is arrested for being on this ship, which curtails his plans to go to Africa. Eventually, his freedom is purchased and he gets out of prison and he takes his family. It is determined that the Synod of Pennsylvania is looking for a black person to do mission work in Philadelphia. So he goes to Philadelphia in 1834, 1835, and within a year he organizes a congregation. And it's a substantial congregation, maybe 50 or 60 people. And they build a church. The church building still stands today. It's a part of the University of Pennsylvania. Jehu Jones, the first African descent pastor, found it literally impossible to operate in white Lutheranism. The white Lutheran pastors would refer to him as that colored minister. They would forget him. They would not take him seriously. They would promise him things and they would not deliver on their promises. And once things fell apart, they blamed him for it.
Church does recognize Jehu Jones. The 24th of November is noted on our Lutheran calendar of saints for Jehu Jones to be recognized by the church. But Bachman also had an assistant black minister trained by Bachman himself. And we probably need to talk about him because I know part of the focus of this story is the unsung stories of our black community. This black minister's name was Boston Drayton.
Well, Boston Drayton was the first African American or Lutheran missionary from the United States to the continent of Africa. He was a missionary in a small colony that was called Maryland, which later merged with Liberia.
Boston Drayton decided he wanted to be a missionary to Liberia, which was established as a colony for freed persons. The idea was, in the early 1800s, that there was no way that this country could have a significant black population. And the best way to solve the slavery problem was to send all formerly enslaved persons back to Africa.
And this all came about because, and I'll say intellectuals like Boston Drayton had become so disillusioned with South Carolina, with the experience of being disenfranchised in the United States, that they agreed with the American Colonization Society in its view that blacks and whites just could not share the space of living in the United States, and blacks needed to reposition themselves in Africa or go home.
The problem with that idea, of course, was that by this point, many of these persons had been in America for 100 years and did not consider Africa their home anymore. Their roots were here, their families were here. But it was a significant effort in the early 1800s by a number of people. Liberia was founded as a colony for these former persons. The capital of Liberia to this day is named Monrovia, after James Monroe, who was president of the United States at that time. And the Constitution of Liberia was modeled on the United States Constitution.
John Bachman, sensing that Boston Drayton was ready for ordination, and arranged for Drayton to be ordained at the South Carolina Synod Convention, and that was in 1845.
So he was ordained by John Bachman, the first ordained African American in the South, sent by the Congregation of St. John's, the Black Congregation of St. John's. They provided the funds to send him to Africa. They provided the support once he got to Africa.
So that's kind of the Boston Drayton story. He left South Carolina with the support of the black people in St. John's and some other blacks who were in other churches in South Carolina, but not the support of the South Carolina Synod.
And he ministers there for a number of years, but the support is just not enough to make it possible to continue. So eventually Boston Drayton enters politics in Liberia and becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Liberia.
I dare say any history book you read concerning the mission work that went from this country to Africa, you will not find Boston Drayton's name mentioned probably, because I don't know. This is why I feel he's one of the top unsung heroes of the era.
This kind of history is just not written. It's not been told. Our project is called UNSUNG, Black Lutherans from South Carolina. Well, here with Boston Drayton, that's a huge one, and that's a huge omission.
And then finally, of course, a very significant figure is Daniel Payne.
Daniel Payne was a young man, about 19 years old, who was self-taught, self-motivated, and he organized a school in Charleston. And this is sometime after the Vesey uprising. So he's teaching these black children, and South Carolina legislature fears this, that a black man is teaching black children. So they passed a law outlawing black teachers or black people teaching black children. That basically shut down his school.
Daniel Payne is a free person of color, has a school, comes to John Bachman one day to ask for him to identify a scientific specimen. And so John Bachman identifies this scientific specimen for him, becomes very interested in Daniel Payne and his school, invites him into his home, introduces him to his family. Daniel Payne remarks in his memoir that John Bachman welcomed him as a full equal.
The other two had joined St. John's, but Daniel Payne was not a member of St. John's in that respect. And I get no sense that he operated at all at St. John. John Bachman had an idea. Daniel Payne, who had ministerial aspirations, ordination aspirations, could be ordained a Lutheran and maybe pursue the goals that he had as a Lutheran.
He goes to John Bachman and some others in Charleston and says, "Can you write me a letter of recommendation?" John Bachman is glad to do that and sends him to a friend of his in the North. And this Lutheran pastor in the North says, "This is providence. We have been looking to give a scholarship to an African American person to come to the Lutheran Seminary at Gettysburg." And so they scholarship him, and he becomes the first African American to attend a Lutheran seminary. He is eventually ordained by the Lutherans, but never finds a Lutheran congregation that's willing to call him. So he eventually joins the AME Church and becomes the most influential bishop of the AME Church of his generation.
He migrates to Baltimore to the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And of course, the end of that story is he becomes, I think, the third bishop of that church and the founder of Wilberforce University in Xenia, Ohio. He lamented in his autobiography what it felt like to be so far from friends and loved ones and families as a student at Gettysburg Seminary. He lamented that he never was able to form authentic relationships with students or even authentic relationship with faculty members. So it's an ordeal. It's been an ordeal for Black Lutherans, especially in the South, to negotiate white spaces. And understand that Jehu Jones, Daniel Payne, and Boston Drayton represent a very short time span. We're talking a matter of 10 years that they're moving through at about the same speed.
The late 19th century was a very troubled period in the South. There's just no other way to put it. It was a very troubled period. After the Civil War, there's a very strong reaction after Reconstruction against African Americans, persons of African descent. The Jim Crow laws come into being. There are occasional notices in, for example, the minutes of the South Carolina Synod. We need to reach out to these persons. They used to be members of our churches, and very little happened.
In 1876, there are race riots in the state of South Carolina and a lot of racial unrest having to do with political parties fighting it over as to who would be in the legislature and all that. In July 22nd of 1876, the St. Michael Church Council meets and they resolve to expel the last of the colored members from the congregation. And the staircase from the inside removed, and the exterior door that was for the use of the colored members would be repurposed for the white congregation. And so that ends, sadly, the history of sort of blacks and whites worshiping here at St. Michael.
I think the story of African American Lutherans in the South is unsung because it's not known. It's just not a very well-known story. We don't know the story of Frederick Lutheran Church in St. Thomas and the Virgin Islands. We don't know the story of African descent leadership going to Africa as missionaries, going to start congregations in the Northeast. We don't know the stories of their existence, really. Early to mid-20th century, there was an emphasis on training up African American Lutheran leadership, again, largely from the Missouri Synod. One of the ways the Missouri Synod was so successful was that they established institutions. And that was a very important method of training up a Black Lutheran leadership.
What I discovered is that throughout, whenever I would meet Black Lutherans, the way they became Lutherans was through the Missouri Synod.
I was raised in the Missouri Synod, and so I know that the Missouri Synod in the 20s and 30s made massive inroads in the black community in the South. There is a story that I would tell you about my first years as a pastor, which would be almost 45 years ago. I served a congregation west of here, a rural congregation, farming congregation, and it was the early 1980s. But I did ask them at one point, because it was a period of time when there were some challenges to sort of the all-white nature of Methodist, Lutheran, Baptist churches in the community. And I said at a council meeting, what would happen if an African American showed up on Sunday morning to worship in our congregation? And they thought for a moment, and they said, well, the council would decide whether they were here to worship or to make trouble. And I was bold enough to ask the question, so how do you decide whether they're here to worship or make trouble? And they said, well, there's no reason for them to come here unless they're here to make trouble.
It's been an ordeal for Black Lutherans, especially in the South, to negotiate white spaces in buildings, white spaces in classrooms. Because when an unfamiliar black person enters white spaces, often the people there immediately try to make sense of this black person, of him or her, to determine who that person is and how they qualify to be here.
The Lutheran Church in the United States is a predominantly white denomination. In fact, we are, by percentage, the whitest denomination in America. We are not as diverse as churches like the Methodist Church, for example, or even the Presbyterian Church. So I think one of the biggest challenges for African American Lutherans is to feel that they have a place in a denomination that is predominantly white.
What has been very important to me is that when we look at 2 Corinthians and we find that we are ambassadors for Christ, we come together under the reconciling spirit of the Lord. And once we come together, then we can move forward together. But first of all, we have to come. So it has not been easy being in the Lutheran Church, but nevertheless, we persist. We are able to feel a part of. And because we feel a part of, we seem to feel more effective. And not only that, then we can spread the word. We are okay in the Lutheran Church. It's okay to be a Lutheran. It's okay to be who you are also.
Yeah, when I think about it being such a white church overall, and then when I look at I think we're well beyond referring to churches as white church and black church, but it is what it is. It still exists in the minds of the people. I'm hoping that what God will show that there is should be no such thing called white church and black church. It should be seen for what it is, Christ church.